CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie O.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Pension reforms will go ahead. French President Macron insists his controversial bill will come into force despite protests.
Our other headlines: China's President Xi Jinping leaves Russia after talks with President Vladimir Putin, but there's no direct support for the war in Ukraine.
All eyes on the Federal Reserve to see if the United States presses ahead with monetary tightening or pauses interest rate rises.
Hand on heart that I did not lie to the House.
Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson mounts a robust defence as MPs question him over whether he deliberately misled Parliament over those lockdown passes.
French President Emmanuel Macron has defended his pension reform plans and insisted the bill will be enacted before the end of the year.
It's the first time Macron has spoken publicly about his changes since his government forced the reform through by bypassing Parliament. The new policy increases retirement age from 62 to 64. It sparked widespread protests. On Monday, Macron's government survived 2 no-confidence votes.
Let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen, who's in Paris. So, Ross, President Macron really doubling down on pushing through these pension reforms.
Yeah, the pension reform is going ahead as planned, according to Emmanuel Macron. It will now go to the next stage in the Constitutional Council, where experts will rule on the constitutionality of the legislation. But he really used his first media appearance since last Thursday, since the controversy, since it was forced through Parliament. He used that first media appearance with 2 TV anchors to defend the pensions reform as something that was crucial, but not something that he was particularly enamoured. He did say he didn't really want it. Ideally, in a perfect world, he wouldn't have had to bring in this legislation. Let's listen in now to a little bit more of what Emmanuel Macron had to say.
There aren't 100 solutions. If we want the pension systems to be balanced, it no longer is. And the more we wait, the more it will get worse. And so this reform is necessary. And I say this to the French people. I don't enjoy doing this. I would have preferred not to do this. But it's also because of a sense of responsibility that I expressed my commitment to do this in front of you.
And Ross, since this reform bill was pushed through Parliament last Thursday, we've seen plenty of protests. Will what President Macron had to say today go any way towards stopping any more?
No, it won't reassure the protesters in any way that he was willing to try to row back on some of the reforms. Robin, we do know there has been a response from the opposition already. Marine Le Pen, who was a former presidential candidate last year, one of the leading figures on the far right in France, has said that she thought that Emmanuel Macron, quote, was more and more alone. And she said that his Prime Minister, Elizabeth Borne, who Emmanuel Macron committed to supporting at the moment to drive the government agenda in the coming weeks, Marine Le Pen saying Elizabeth Borne had been pulverised by the recent events. Philippe Martinez, a leading figure in one of France's top unions, said there was no recognition by the President of the strength and support for the protests that we have seen since the start of the year and which we are going to see again tomorrow. Robin?
Ross, thank you very much. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
China's president has ended his state visit to Russia with no progress on peace efforts for the war in Ukraine.
Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin bid each other farewell after 2 days of talks in Moscow. The leaders called for responsible dialogue to resolve the Ukraine conflict. They referred to each other as dear friends, promised economic cooperation and described their countries' relations as the best they've ever been.
Our correspondent Yong Chung-shi reports now from Moscow.
The joint statement on China and Russia's strategic partnership did lay out the 2 countries' consensus on the issue of Ukraine. Now, both sides say they emphasize the importance of adhering to the principle of the United Nations Charter and respecting international law. Now, Russia has commended China's impartial position on the issue, and both sides condemn any actions that harm other countries' legitimate security interest. Now, Russia has reaffirmed its commitment to peace talks, and China has proposed constructive solutions to the political settlement of the crisis. Now, the two sides stress the importance of respecting the security concerns of all countries and preventing bloc confrontation. Now, they urge responsible dialogue as the best solution and calls for an end to moves that lead to tensions or prolong the fighting. Both sides oppose unilateral sanctions not authorized by the UN Security Council and instead calls for the international community to support constructive efforts to resolve the crisis.
Now, they were also talking about cooperation and trade. What would stronger Russian-China ties look like for the wider international economy? What would it mean?
Well, the meetings were a major milestone for China and Russia's economic ties. The relationship is further solidified by the two joint statements on strategic partnership and economic cooperation. Now, several new developments were included in the two statements, and here are some of them. Now, meetings between leaders usually provide impetus to top-level regulatory upgrades and optimization. Now, both sides have agreed to promote the drafting of a new version of the investment cooperation plan outline, and they have welcomed the launch of new negotiations for investment agreement signed in 2006. Now, these moves are expected to create a more stable, fair, transparent, and predictable business environment for investors from everywhere. Now, other measures will expand the scale of trade. Now, first is developing e-commerce, where Chinese platforms have world-leading expertise. When goods are bought and sold online, logistics becomes the next challenge, and that's why the second measure will see both sides working to ensure convenient transportation by rail, road, air, waterways, and sea. Now, thirdly, China and Russia will increase the use of local currency for trade, investment, and loans. This, experts say, can reduce the reliance on the American dollar for settlements, lower exchange rate risks, and make bilateral trade more efficient. Now, these measures are interlinked together, and they are expected to optimize trade between the two countries. And experts say the economic benefits generated from it will benefit every investors that have projects in these two countries.
Julia Melnikova is from the Russian International Affairs Council. I asked her about what the meeting means for the future relationship between China and Russia.
Well, as for the joint statement, I believe that the most remarkable part was the economic planning horizon, because actually it's up to 2030, which is quite a short-term planning scheme. And so we can now see China and Russia being sure about this time span and not willing to plan further because, well, actually strategic planning is now extremely hard. And if we look at the text, we can see that there are these innovative spheres, high-tech, logistics, transport, things that Russia has always been wanting from China to confirm being interested in. And now we see that they are going as points number 1, 2, 3, so like even before energy cooperation. So I think it's a good sign for the bilateral trade to go forward and for the bilateral relations to go forward economically.
So how significant is it that the two sides have reaffirmed that relationship?
Well, it is significant, of course, because the relationship have, they have had their own dynamics, which has been developing very positively. So it has its own dynamic regardless of the crisis in Europe or wherever else. But we know that there is a crisis in Europe, and in the current circumstances, I believe it's like very remarkable and significant that the visit took place before yesterday.
And the leaders said that the relationship between China and Russia did not constitute a military political alliance, but instead a close partnership. What do you think that will look like going forward?
Well, I believe it will stay the same because any sort of military cooperation now is, it would be detrimental to China's foreign policy as it tries to establish itself as a neutral mediator both in the conflict and globally. So it's trying to come up with its own global initiatives like global security initiative, peace plan for Ukraine. So for China, it's actually now detrimental to its image to sign any military agreements or blocs.
So how important is the relationship for the global landscape?
Well, it is, as probably the counterweight to the West, as the countries position themselves, and as something stable in the chaotic order. I believe that's what Russia values in this partnership, that it actually remains credible and it remains solid throughout all this turmoil that we have been experiencing.
Russia's foreign minister says plans to send depleted uranium to Ukraine will mark a serious escalation. Sergei Lavrov was speaking after the UK announced plans to send the armour-piercing rounds to Kyiv, along with its delivery of Challenger 2 tanks. Moscow claims the shells have a nuclear component, but Britain has accused President Vladimir Putin of spreading false information. Earlier, Putin warned that Russia will be forced to respond if the delivery goes ahead. Let's talk now to our correspondent, Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, what has the Russian leadership been saying about this shell delivery?
Well, the shells are designed with these uranium tips to try to pierce armour more effectively, and the British Ministry of Defence says it's very effective. The International Atomic Energy Agency says that because it's depleted uranium, it's far less radioactive than natural uranium, and it is, under international law, allowed to be used. But the Russian president says he is treating it as an escalation because, indeed, that these components do contain uranium within them. And the defence minister here in Moscow says that he believes this is another step towards a potential nuclear confrontation with the West. The Russian Foreign Ministry is also pointing to concerns that it could be damaging for the environment in Ukraine and potentially pose a threat to Ukrainian citizens' health. Here's the Russian Foreign Minister speaking earlier.
Everybody remembers what results the use of depleted uranium shells had in Yugoslavia and Iraq, when tens of thousands of civilians and NATO soldiers who used those shells were affected. There was a spike in oncological and other dangerous diseases. The soil was poisoned for decades.
Stuart, what's been the response from the UK's Ministry of Defence?
Well, firstly, on those claims from the Russian Foreign Minister, there is hotly debated evidence about whether there has been an increase in cancers within the former Yugoslavia, and also whether that can be attributed to the use of depleted uranium shells. The UK Defence Ministry, in its assessment, says that the independent evidence that it believes exists shows that risk is likely to be low. But on the potential for nuclear escalation, the Foreign Minister of the UK, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, said that he believes Russia is trying to stir up a disinformation campaign, that the depleted uranium shells are not any form of nuclear weapon, they just contain uranium. He also suggested that they are no threat to Russia, they are purely about Ukraine defending itself. The United States, although its tanks can use depleted uranium shells, has said it's not going to send them with any deliveries of its tanks to Ukraine.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Will they or won't they? A decision on raising interest rates shortly. We'll take you to Wall Street next, where all eyes are on the Fed.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The world's most indebted property developer, Evergrande, has unveiled a restructuring plan for its offshore debt. This follows the company acquiring support from its overseas creditors. Evergrande, once China's top-selling developer, has offshore debts of almost $23 billion as part of liabilities totaling $300 billion. Now, founded in the late 1990s in the Chinese city of Guangzhou, Evergrande's founder, Xu Jiayin, adopted an aggressive growth strategy that catapulted the company to the top of the national real estate industry. The firm says it grew to have 200,000 employees, but indirectly created more than 3.8 million jobs every year. Evergrande shares and bonds were included in indexes and funds across Asia. Well, besides building homes, the conglomerate also ventured into other industries, including electric vehicles, life insurance, sport, and even a theme park. Well, after expanding rapidly for years and snapping up assets as China's economy boomed, Evergrande became snowed under a debt of $300 billion. In 2020, Chinese regulators set new limits on property developers' debt levels, and Evergrande was the world's most indebted property group. Well, the company sold off assets and delayed bond repayments in a bid to try to stay afloat. In August 2021, many Evergrande projects across the country halted construction due to overdue payments. Then, around a year later, bondholders refused to accept any more delays. As questions grew over their handling of company finances, the CEO and the CFO stepped down and Evergrande's Hong Kong headquarters were put up for sale. Well, Hong Hao is chief economist at Grow Investment Group. I asked him about the next steps for Evergrande.
I think, more likely than not, they're going to extend the maturity so that they can lower the coupon rate they have to pay. So that, for 2022, the contracted sales for Evergrande actually, plunged more than 40%. All right, so according to some public information. Even though, the audited result is late to file, but we can already see some very distressed financial numbers that are showing up. So they have to cut down the debt, and they also have to clean up the inventory. They probably have to do some asset disposal so that they can recover some money to pay off some of the liabilities that is already past due, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, very complex situation. But I think, the person who administered the Hainan Air, which is another heavily indebted company before Evergrande, so she has plenty of experience administering very complex deals, and hopefully, she can work wonder again here.
Very briefly, are you an optimist? What do you think the broader outlook is for the Chinese property market?
For the month of February, we're seeing pickup in sales, especially with the SOE firms, right? So SOE firms, February sales is up 44%. But I think private firms sales is down 33%, right? So overall, it's a very mixed picture. We need more data to confirm that the recovery is in place, and hopefully going into the second half of this year, we see healthier numbers.
The turmoil in the US banking sector continues, with all eyes on the Federal Reserve to see if the central bank presses ahead with its monetary tightening or puts interest rate rises on pause. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett on Wall Street. So, John, yes. The Fed in the spotlight.
In the spotlight, Jamie and Robin, absolutely another momentous moment coming up in about an hour and a half or so from now. And this is the first time the central bank, the Federal Reserve, has met amid a banking crisis for 15 years. Now, the last time was back in 2008, when those two huge behemoth investment banks went over, Bear Stearns in March and Lehman Brothers in, I think it was September of 2008. We haven't had a banking crisis since then, but boy, do we have one now. Now, it might actually be easing. It's a bit too early to say, but I don't think it is completely gone away just yet. So the Federal Reserve's decision today is to balance between the banking crisis, which obviously they don't want to get worse, and also going on combating inflation, which they have vowed to do until they get it down from its present 6% to about 2%, which is where they would like it to be. So In the course of the last week, we've had lots of people giving lots of opinions, and I will tell you, if you talk to any economist you talk to here, each one has a different view on what the Federal Reserve is going to do. But the consensus here now is that they will hike interest rates by pretty much the smallest amount that they usefully can, which is 25 basis points, so a quarter point. That would be the 9th interest rate hike since the inflation issue broke out in almost exactly 1 year. The range would move to 4.75 to 5%, and we are thinking, or we thought, that they might go as high as 6% before they finally stop hiking interest rates in July. But that's now very much in doubt because of the banking crisis. Now, there had been talk that they might actually do nothing. And they may still, I have to caution you on that, they may still do nothing, not raise interest rates today at all, but to pause. The trouble is, if they do that, people are going to say, well, what do they know about the banking crisis then that we don't know? There must be something under the hood or under the bonnet that we don't know that they do know. So that's why people are putting their money on a 25 basis point increase. That seems to have been priced in. And at the moment, the markets are very flat ahead of the decision. Dow down 52, NASDAQ down just 2, S&P 500 down just 4, and that decision comes, the bulletin anyway, will come in, what is it now, in about an hour and 40 minutes from now.
So, John, let's talk about that banking crisis then, because there are still some issues with the banks, aren't there?
Yes, there are. I told you on yesterday's programme, I told you it wasn't going away, and then after I left the programme yesterday, we went downstairs here, and the latest buzz was that basically JP Morgan Chase, which is one of the biggest banks in the world and the one that people talk about most in the United States, really, led by that guy Jamie Dimon, who's never far from the headlines, they're trying to sell First Republic Bank, and they can't find anybody to buy it. See? Now, First Republic Bank is another one of these regional banks, like Signature was, and SVB, which started all of this last week. It's based in San Francisco. And the history of this is that it's the one that last week 11 banks got together and plowed $30 billion into their coffers. Turns out not to be enough. So on Monday, their shares were down 47%. Yesterday, Tuesday, because of Janet Yellen's comments saying that the federal authorities would guarantee depositors in banks should there be another run on any of them in the future. Yesterday, First Republic had its best day ever and closed up 29%. And right now it is flat, down 4%. It's lost 89% of its value in just the last week or so. And that is because the buyers who are sniffing around say, well, yes, we might buy it, but we want government backing. Now, where have you heard that before? Oh, yes, in Switzerland on Sunday. Thanks a lot, Switzerland, because all that money that the Swiss are ploughing in to prop up Credit Suisse, people here want it if they're going to take over a bank like First Republic, which is why we say the banking crisis is not yet over just yet. Remembering the mid-sized banks said at the weekend that they think the federal authorities here should back depositors for at least the next 2 years. And I'm afraid that's where we're at the moment. The next big thing, though, will be this Fed decision in about an hour and a half from now. We'll see what happens after that.
Well, John, I'm sure we'll be talking about that tomorrow. But for now, thank you very much. Correspondent John Terrett in New York.
UK inflation jumped unexpectedly last month to 10.4% following 3 consecutive months of slowing. Salad and vegetable shortages helped push up food prices at the fastest rate in 45 years. Alcohol prices in restaurants and pubs also drove up costs for households. The increase adds to pressure on the Bank of England to increase interest rates again this week.
British ministers have delayed raising the retirement age from 66 to 68 as life expectancy falls in the UK. Some Conservative MPs have expressed concern that an increase may provoke a backlash from middle-aged voters. Raising the state pension age is controversial. The decision will now be pushed until after next year's election.
Chinese tech giant Tencent saw profits fall steeply last year as the country emerged from COVID lockdown restrictions. Annual profits were down 16% year-on-year for the WeChat owner. That's despite a modest rise in revenue in the 3 months to December. Tencent said it'll increase cost-cutting in 2023 by selling off less profitable parts of its business to refocus on its gaming and short video platforms.
Billionaire Richard Branson's cash-strapped Virgin Orbit looks to be nearing a deal for $200 million of emergency funding. The aerospace company said it would resume operations on Thursday and prepare for its next mission by recalling some of its employees. It was forced to send staff home last week, telling US regulators it was in talks with lenders. Virgin Orbit has been grappling with mounting losses in recent quarters in a highly competitive market.
Sri Lanka's president says the next round of talks with creditors will take place in April as the country received its first portion of a $3 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Ranil Wickremesinghe said it lays the foundation for a strong new economy and will restore foreign investors' confidence. The country defaulted on its foreign debt last year as it plunged into its worst economic crisis in 7 decades.
Now, what's it going to cost for the global economy to reach net zero by 2050?
Money spent on clean energy must quadruple within the next 2 decades, leaping from $1 trillion a year to $3.5 trillion a year.
Well, that's according to the Energy Transitions Commission. I've been speaking to the chair, Lord Adair Turner.
Well, look, the report says there is enough money, but that investment will only occur with the right, forceful policies. And they are different policies in different parts of the world. In the world outside China, for instance, we are not seeing renewables yet being built at the pace required. And that's not really a shortage of finance, at least in the rich developed world. It's barriers to the rollout of renewables, things like planning and permitting systems, which slow down the pace at which renewables are built. Now, in other parts of the world, we have different challenges. In China, I would say, the biggest challenge is that too much is invested in real estate, with very cement-intensive and steel-intensive construction, including into a lot of real estate, which will probably end up wasted. And China has to complete and go further down a transition in economy away from a construction-led, real estate-led economy, which it often is when it's trying to recover from a slowdown. As for the developing world, that is where there sometimes is an actual shortage of a finance available, and that's where there's a big role for the multilateral development banks as well as national development banks lending out overseas. So very different challenges between, let's say, rich developed world, China, lower income developed world. In each of them, this transition is absolutely possible, but there are different challenges that we've got to overcome in each of those situations.
So when it comes to the finance for this, the report calls for investments to triple in less than 10 years. Is that realistic?
Let's remember that these sums of money, they sound massive. You know, people look and say, oh, God, you know, $3 trillion. The global economy is an economy of over $100 trillion of GDP. The world invests in something or other each year over $25 trillion of GDP. So one's got to just find a way to make sure that of that $25 trillion and growing, rather than $1 trillion a year today, by 2030, $3 trillion a year is being spent on all the things that we need to create the zero carbon economy of the future.
We've seen an energy crisis in the last few months with potentially worse to come. Is it sensible for countries like the UK, for example, to move towards green energy now? Aren't we in a place where we need the security of tried and tested technology?
This energy crisis that we've faced over the last year, yes, it has, because of high prices of gas, produced somewhat of a return to coal to a limited extent in some countries. But on the whole, what I think it will do is accelerate a move towards renewables and low carbon solutions. And I think it needs to do that because that is the only way for us across the whole world to avoid the potentially catastrophic effects of climate change.
But what do you think the world needs in terms of policy and regulation to make this change happen?
What we need coming up to COP28 in Abu Dhabi this coming December, is a reinforcement of the determination of the world to set tighter targets, but it then has to be up for individual countries to drive faster development of renewables, faster phase out of internal combustion engines, faster phase out of coal-powered generation in particular, and a shift of heavy industry, aluminium, steel, cement, chemicals, towards the new zero-carbon technologies which we know do exist.
And you can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. What's the story surrounding depleted uranium being sent to Ukraine with British tanks? We'll have the lowdown from a military expert next.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail. The background.
Defense ministers from
The wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Pension reforms will go ahead. French President Macron insists his controversial bill will come into force despite protests.
Our other headlines: China's President Xi Jinping leaves Russia after talks with President Vladimir Putin, but there's no direct support for the war in Ukraine.
And all eyes on the Federal Reserve to see if the United States presses ahead with monetary tightening or pauses interest rate rises.
Britain's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly says the UK's supply of depleted uranium to Ukraine is not nuclear escalation. This comes after Russia condemned London's plans to send the munitions to Kyiv, claiming they have a nuclear component. Well, Louise Jones is head of intelligence at defence analysts Mackenzie Intelligence Services. Louise, welcome back to the programme. For those of us who are not military experts, what is depleted uranium used for in warfare, and what is its key purpose?
So just to understand that depleted uranium comes from the process to make nuclear fuel, where uranium ore is processed and you get enriched uranium, which then goes on to be used as nuclear fuel in the nuclear industry. And then what you have left is depleted uranium, which has got very low radioactivity and of a different type to that in enriched uranium. Now, depleted uranium has a property in that it is exceedingly dense metal. Much denser than many metals such as lead. And it's actually that property, which has nothing to do with the fact that it was used for its uranium, means that it's actually very effective to use in a warhead, because for the size and weight of the metal, you have a very effective penetrative weapon to be used against anti-armor or anti-tank. And that's why it's used. It's nothing to do with any small radioactive components that it may have.
OK, that understood. This is still a high-risk substance, isn't it? I mean, what are the dangers of depleted uranium for humans in the vicinity when it explodes and the environment?
So, obviously, it's very effective at piercing armour, and it is also flammable. So what it can do is cause an incendiary effect when it does pierce a tank, for example. So it's very effective, but then all anti-tank weaponry will have that effect. Now, whilst it does have very low radioactivity, it's of a kind that normally can't penetrate human skin. So just being in the vicinity of it whilst it's part of a warhead that hasn't been used or just simply nearby doesn't really have any discernible effect. The issues may come from where it is then becomes present in aerosols after an explosion. So, for example, in the vicinity after it has been used on a target. There's also some discussion about the effects after an explosion on soil or the nearby groundwater, and those after effects are slightly less clear. But, you know, this shouldn't be considered in any way similar to a radioactive weapon. The UN doesn't classify it as anywhere near the threshold for a nuclear or chemical weapon. And any effects it might do, if you do happen to ingest it as an aerosol effect, for example, is that it will do things like raise the risk of cancer, unless you ingest it in very large quantities, in which case it will cause more immediate effects. So really, we shouldn't understand depleted uranium in the context of a nuclear or a chemical type weapon. Really, it's a conventional weapon that has some characteristics of very low radioactivity.
There's nothing new about its use, is there? I mean, it's been used before in the former Yugoslavia and during the Gulf War. I mean, what do we learn from its use there?
So, yeah, it was used as far back as the first Gulf War in 1990, and it was used in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as well. It's been a very common part of both the American and the UK, British armoured warheads. But really, and Russia also has access to this technology. Really, any country that has access to nuclear fuel processing can make depleted uranium. So it's really nothing new. It's a very standard part of warheads for the UK and US. So really, the fact that it's being sent is sort of as soon as we started to commit weapons platforms like Challenger 2, really it was almost for granted that we would send the warheads with it that have depleted uranium. So really in line with expectations of the current level of support to Ukraine.
And what might its use mean for the war in Ukraine?
So really it should be understood as part of the provision of the whole package of advanced tanks, advanced artillery and rocket systems. So really taken by itself, it really won't make any difference per se, but really should be understood as part of that wider package of sending Challenger 2 tanks, for example. And that will really help the Ukrainians as these platforms, as their troops get training and these platforms start to be used on the front line, which is still some way away yet.
We see you every so often on this programme and ask you the same sad question in a sense, a sit rep on where this conflict is going. We're now in March, we're in spring essentially. Where are we and where is it going and when will it end?
So, unfortunately, we've seen some really heavy fighting in around the city of Bakhmut, which has had a very high casualty rate, and that has been very sad to see. It's sort of been interesting from a military perspective in that the city of Bakhmut is not necessarily militarily important. Really, what it has shown is that both Ukraine and Russia are quite happy simply just to be fighting. They're trying to wear each other down, both in terms of munitions, will to fight, and soldiers. And really where we'll see is that Russia has, bit by bit, started to close off Bakhmut, and I would expect to see Russians' complete takeover of that city within the coming months. The Ukrainians will very carefully pick when they decide to withdraw, as they did, for example, in Mariupol, which is a similar one where the Russians were able to encircle. And unfortunately, what this will mean for the wider war is that I really don't think that there is a clear pathway to resolution for either side. For Ukraine, they have repeatedly said, repeatedly committed that they do not see a path to a ceasefire, that doesn't see the return of all the land that Russia has captured so far. And really what also Ukraine will be looking for is guarantees that were there to be a ceasefire called, that Russia wouldn't use that to rearm, refuel and reman their forces. So unfortunately, we're still very much in the military phase of this conflict, and I think we shall see, unfortunately, high casualty rates on the news for some months to come.
Louise Jones, thank you very much. Louise Jones, Head of Intelligence at Defence Analyst, McKinsey Intelligence Services.
Now, today is World Water Day, an annual event dedicated to solving the world's water and sanitation crisis. And for the first time in almost 5 decades, the United Nations is also holding a water conference to try and accelerate the push towards universal access to clean water and sanitation by 2030. More than 2 billion people worldwide still lack access to safe drinking water. That's a quarter of the world's population. More than 800,000 people die each year from diseases directly attributed to unsafe water and inadequate sanitation. Globally, 80% of wastewater is released into the environment without any treatment, and in many developing countries that figure is 99%. And the impact of climate change on water is being felt at a growing rate. Since the year 2000, floods have increased by 134%, while droughts are lasting 29% longer. Well, our correspondent Jodie Jacobs is at the conference in New York. So, Jodie, what are they hoping for from this conference?
Well, this conference, of course, coincides, as you said, with World Water Day, and the conference has brought together some 6,000 delegates here in New York City. Its aim is to, of course, review the implementation of the UN's Decade for Action on Water and Sanitation. The statistics around water that we've heard throughout the course of this morning is staggering, according to the World Health Organization. And ultimately, delegates here have the opportunity at this water conference to discuss ways to mitigate this. Now, also, this morning, the UN released a report that has warned of a looming global crisis and an imminent risk to water shortages due to overconsumption and, of course, climate change. It says that the report should be worrying to the world and that we should all take heed of this, and if not addressed, could have dire consequences for the world. So, of course, this is going to be the discussion over the next 3 days here at the United Nations headquarters in New York, as delegates obviously try and find ways and means of best to deal with the water crisis in the world, find new funding mechanisms, and of course the UN Secretary General saying that member countries now need to urgently look at ways in which to solve this water problem in the world.
So is there a sense amongst those at the conference that progress can be made towards that goal of clean water for everyone by 2030?
Well, there is a clear sense here at the United Nations, and it has been on the agenda for a couple of months, and that drive towards the sustainable and, of course, the progress towards clean water by 2030 is being prioritized. It was prioritized in the General Assembly. It's even been prioritized in the Security Council here at the United Nations. The UN Secretary General this morning said that water, he says in his words, is in deep trouble, and the world is draining humanity's lifeblood through overconsumption and unsustainable use of water. So he says that this must be, of course, front and center of the discussions over the next couple of days. But indeed, and you can see from delegates that are here from across the world, some 6,000 or so of them that I've said, are putting that on the agenda, and that there are many, many delegations from member states, of course, putting this on their agenda as well. And the issue is receiving the necessary attention. But of course, as the UN says, it needs more attention than ever before.
Jodie, thank you very much. Our correspondent Jodie Jacobs in New York.
Now, its environmental importance is so significant, it's known as the kidney of North China. But the Bayangdian wetlands were under threat from pollution. Then a plan launched 6 years ago aimed to try and reverse it. Our correspondent Ning Hong reports.
Once the largest freshwater lake and wetland in North China, years of pollution and drought nearly dried up Bayangdian. Now, after 6 years of treatment, Baiyangdian has regained its picturesque scenery.
Our goal is to protect and restore the environment of Baiyangdian, mainly through 3 aspects: controlling the water quality entering Baiyangdian, reducing pollution sources in the water, and ecological water replenishment, introducing more and better quality water sources.
The Shung'anyu area was established in 2017, and the protection of the ecological environment was a key factor in urban planning. In recent years, the local Ecological Environment Bureau, together with departments such as water conservation and agriculture, has taken a series of actions to restore the water quality, environment, and ecology of Baiyangdian.
The ecological environment and water quality of Baiyangdian have undergone a fundamental change, and the water quality has been upgraded from the level 5 to level 3. According to our observation records, the number of wild bird species has reached 252, an increase of 46 species compared to before the establishment of the Shung'anyu area. The number of fish species has also increased to 46, an increase of 19 species compared to before.
In the north of Baiyangdian, a new city is under construction. It's designed to be a green, ecological, and livable city. The water area of Baiyangdian expanding, with an average depth of 6 to 7 meters, and nearby groundwater has also significantly improved. Ling Hong, CGTN, Hebei Province.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson mounts a robust defence as MPs question whether he misled Parliament over those lockdown parties.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been making a highly anticipated appearance to answer questions from MPs investigating whether he deliberately misled Parliament over Downing Street parties during lockdown.
These are the live pictures from Westminster. Now, this hearing is seen as crucial for Boris Johnson's political future. We'll stay on the pictures, but bring in the voice of our correspondent Michael Voss, who's spent much of the day watching the story. This has been going on for hours now.
It has. We're what, sort of 3 hours into it already. He arrived just after 2 local time, had to swear on a Bible that he was going to tell the truth. This is all about alleged social gatherings and parties in Downing Street during strict COVID lockdown rules. All sorts of photographs appeared showing gatherings, Boris Johnson holding drinks, bottles on table. At the time, he went to Parliament and said there were no parties, it all followed the rules. Then came a police report where he was fined for breaking the rules. He went back to the House and said, sorry about that, but it was unintentional. Everyone told me that it was legal. Now this is what this is trying to establish, The committee chairperson, Harriet Harman, said that democracy depends on trust, and then went into what they're looking for. Let's hear what she had to say.
That I have just launched, in which in the same PMQs,
we are examining what Mr. Johnson said to the House about gatherings in number 10. Whether what he said to the House was correct or not. Whether, and if so, how quickly and comprehensively any misleading statement was corrected. If a statement was misleading, we will then consider whether that was a genuine error or if it was reckless or intentional.
Now, if it was intentional, this could cost Boris Johnson his political career. He'd be potentially suspended from Parliament. If it was more than 10 days, there might be a by-election. Were he to lose that, then it's finished. Now, he's been mounting a very strong defence. He was shown pictures of him holding a glass of alcohol. He said it was an event where he saying farewell to colleagues, and these events were normal. Let's hear what his defence has been.
I'm here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House. When those statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. When this inquiry was set up, I was completely confident that you would find nothing to show I knew or believed anything else, as indeed you have not.
And Michael, this hearing paused at one stage, didn't it? So there could be a vote on the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. What happened with that?
Well, as you say, about 10 minutes into Boris Johnson's testimony, the bell went, they all had to go off and vote. He said he'd vote against the Prime Minister, as did a number of other Conservative members. This is about the post-Brexit deal that Boris Johnson had signed. Rishi Sunak did an agreement with the European Union to try and make it work better. It was seen as a historic agreement. When it came to the vote, about 20 members of his ruling Conservative Party voted against it. Really not a very large number. I think out of this one, it strengthens the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and Boris Johnson finds himself in a minority on this.
Michael, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Michael Voss.
As the United Nations marks the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, our correspondent Elizabeth Mearns has been speaking to members of one community here in the UK who face their own challenges.
I didn't know quite what to expect. I decided to look at Asian racism, so I wasn't quite sure what I would uncover when I started to talk to people about it, but I was actually quite shocked from some of the stories, particularly about the explosion of racism that has happened in the West since the pandemic. And I spoke to Fiona Sim, and she told me about her family story, which I thought was particularly awful.
When I go home sometimes, you know, I'm wary of walking down the street as a Chinese person in a white neighborhood because I know that the looks and the sort of attitudes people have towards me. Even my own family last year, we were the targets of an arson attack in which our home got burned down. And, you know, the perpetrator was someone who felt failed by the state, and that anger got displaced on us, Chinese family trying to run a family business.
That was Fiona Sim, and for more on the story, go over to our website or via the CGTN app, or head over to our social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube.
Security forces in Lebanon have fired tear gas at hundreds of protesters, mainly retired members of the army, who tried to break through the fence leading to the government headquarters in Beirut. Demonstrators are outraged at the deteriorating value of state pensions paid in the local currency. The Lebanese pound has lost more than 98% of its value against the US dollar since 2019.
12 people have been killed and hundreds injured in a powerful earthquake that hit large parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The 6.5 magnitude earthquake caused landslides and sent people running from their homes in freezing temperatures. The quake centre was in a remote area, difficult for rescue teams to access.
Muslim authorities in Saudi Arabia and several other Middle Eastern countries say this year's fasting month of Ramadan will begin on Thursday. The date is chosen by the expected sighting of the crescent moon. During Ramadan, Muslims across the world refrain from eating from sunrise to sunset. London's Piccadilly Circus became the location of the first ever celebratory Ramadan lights in the British capital when they were switched on Tuesday.
In Iran and many other parts of the world, millions of people are celebrating the Persian New Year known as Nowruz.
The ancient holiday, which marks the first day of spring, goes back thousands of years. Our correspondent Asiye Namdar reports.
Nowruz, which means a new day, is a celebration of spring, the rebirth of nature and new beginnings. It's the biggest and most festive celebration of the year for Iranians. In the days before, people buy new clothes, flowers and gifts and prepare for traditional meals with family and friends. Nowruz is recognized by the UN as an intangible cultural heritage. Even Mickey Mouse understands its significance.
I'm so excited to share with you a very special holiday celebration. Nowruz! It's the Persian New Year!
But this Persian New Year feels different for some. The death of a young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, in the custody of morality police last year triggered outrage and widespread protests.
This Nowruz feels very bittersweet. We're very excited to usher in the new year, but we can't all help but stop and just have our hearts go out to all the women, all the young girls, the schoolgirls.
They came together from near and far to mark the new year in the Washington, D.C. area, which has one of the largest Iranian communities in the U.S. The centerpiece of every Nowruz celebration is an ornate arrangement of 7 or more symbolic items on a setting called Sofre Hafsin.
Seer is garlic. It is for medicine and for health. This is somag, which is sumac, and it's for sunshine and brightness. The fish, that's for life and movement. And this is seke, for coins. It's for prosperity.
At the precise moment the new year began, good wishes, kisses and hugs, a time to reflect on the past and look forward to a brighter future. My favorite place is the kitchen. Preparations well underway for herb rice and fish, or sabzi polo mahi, a traditional dish on every table. Nowruz comes to a close on the 13th day of the new year with outdoor picnics. It is considered unlucky to stay home, so families head outside to celebrate nature. Sprouts, or sabzeh from the Hafsin table, are thrown into flowing water, symbolizing letting go of the past, getting rid of pain, sorrow and sickness for the coming new year. A ritual which perhaps carries more meaning now than in previous years.
Asiye Namdar reporting.
The headlines again. Pension reforms will go ahead. French President Macron insists his controversial bill will come into force despite protests.
China's President Xi Jinping leaves Russia after talks with President Vladimir Putin, but there's no direct support for the war in Ukraine.
And all eyes on the Federal Reserve to see if the United States presses ahead with monetary tightening or pauses interest rate rises.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
Or you can head to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.